Welcome, 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 everybody, to our continuing discussion with reporters, professors, scholars, philosophers, activists, people on the left, people on the right, anybody. We don't care. We want to have intelligent conversations and provide the information directly to you, the public, so you can do this really weird thing that they taught me in high school. It's not that popular anymore today, but I'm trying to bring it back, called Think for Yourself. We're going to give the information. I'm not going to tell you how to think. You're going to have to put on the thinking cap and come to your own conclusions that might be different from your neighbors and friends. And that's why we provide the information to you. With us today is Joel Kotkin. He works at Chapman University at the Center for Demographics and Policy. He's also the author of many books on geography, The New Geography, and The Human City, Urbanism for the Best of Us. Joel is an internationally recognized authority on global, economic, political, and social trends. He's also an author of the widely praised new book, The New Class Conflict, which describes the changing dynamics of class in America. Mr. Kotkin is the Roger Hobbs Presidential Fellow in Urban Studies at Chapman University. He's the California Executive Director of the Houston-based Urban Reform Institute. He is Executive Director of the widely read website, newgeography.com, where he writes his weekly New Geographer column for Forbes.com. He's also a regular contributor to the Daily Beast. His previous books include The Next 100 Million, America in 2050, published by Penguin Press. His book explores how the nation will evolve in the next 4 decades. His previously also critically acclaimed book, The City, A Global History, was also well recognized. The New York Times describes Mr. Kotkin as America's urban geographer. Joel Kotkin is an internationally recognized authority on global, economic, political, and social trends. He authored The Human City, Urbanism for the Rest of Us in 2016 and co-edited with MIT's Alan Berger the 2018 edition collection Infinite Suburbia. Kotkin is the Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University in Orange, California, and Executive Director of the Houston-based Center for Opportunity Urbanism. He's a senior advisor to the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute. He also writes regularly for the Orange County Register, where he's also served on the editorial board. His writings have also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Washington Examiner, City Journal, Politico, New York Daily News, and Newsweek. And there he is as a professor at Chapman University, Center for Demographics and Policy. Today, we're going to talk about this article in The Spectator, How America's Big Sort Will Upend Politics. It's a reprint from the article on his site, New Geography. Let me ask you, Professor, did I get anything wrong? Is there something we need to correct about your bio or your background?
Well, obviously, you must have an old bio because I basically write now for The Spectator, Unheard, Quillette, Spiked. I still write for the LA Times, and I'm currently also basically working on I have obviously the book on neo-feudalism, which is sort of the most recent book.
Nice. I'll have to check that out. Let me just get this out of the way so that we can have a nice conversation.
Okay.
I have followed you for 20 years, so I'm going to try to control my fanboyism because I have read you since I was a 20-year-old and watched you, and it's kind of a big honor for me to be able to interview you. I remember reading about you when I was a young boy, just getting into college. So I'll keep that tamped down. Let's talk about this article, How America's Big Sort Will Upend Politics. You wrote it in February 2023. What is this article about?
Well, I mean, basically,
why did you write it now?
Excuse me?
Why write about it now? Why is this an important topic to talk about now? And what were you trying to say?
Because what we're seeing is a division of the country along regional lines. That's probably what the biggest thing I look at, and geographic lines. Like, for instance, urban centers in America are solidly blue, and very often fairly left. The countryside is very red, and also is a uh, tends also to sometimes go to the extreme right. Then you've got in between, the one place that really is up for grabs is the suburbs, because the suburbs, that's where rural people come into the metropolitan area and where people from the cities are moving out. So you get a mixture of people. You also get a very diverse mixture. Right now, the most diverse parts of the United States are in the suburbs and exurbs. 96% of all the growth in suburbia over the last 10, 15 years has taken place in among minorities, Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians. So when academics who are, generally behind the curve by a long shot, they'll say, well, it's white flight. It's not white flight. Black people leaving Chicago because they don't want to have their kids in trouble, and where maybe the economic opportunities, moving to the Chicago suburbs, that's not white flight. The Hispanics are moving and the Asians are moving heavily to suburbs because guess what? They have kids. And if you have kids, you don't really want to live in a 1-bedroom apartment where there's homeless people downstairs.
And gangs.
I mean, I have a former student of mine who, she happens to be, there's a Hispanic family, but, she lives in San Francisco, grew up in San Francisco. She says she gets up in the morning and there's human poop in front of the house. She's got 2 young kids. She said, I'm gone. I can't do this. I take the child to Walgreens to buy a little toy, and some guy pushes me out of the way, steals the stuff, and walks out the door. What kind of lesson are we having?
Exactly.
So people are moving away from the core cities, generally speaking. They, by the way, have been doing this for 50 years. It's just accelerated now. But about 90% of all the growth in metropolitan America in the last decade was in the suburbs and exurbs. So that is really the critical geography. The other big divide, and it's related to this, is those who have kids and those who don't. I mean, it's almost as if you have children today, you will tend to have very different views than people who don't have kids. Like, for instance, if you look at the issues of, do I want my 5-year-old to be exposed to, drag queens?
Exactly.
I'm probably not too happy about it. On the other hand, if I'm a 35-year-old single person in the city, well, what are you worried about? Well, because you never had kids. The first instinct of a person who has children is to protect their children. That's the first thing.
I've seen what you're talking about. I had a friend, super, super liberal activist, Black Lives Matter rallies, immigration rallies, all super hardcore, going to LA and Bay Area and loving it. And then she had 2 children, and her children became 2 and 4. And one was a girl and one was a boy. And she's trying to teach them, you're a girl, you're a boy, don't hit your sister, things like this. And she goes to a reading and they have transgender story time. And she calls me really upset. And she goes, Marcus, I support LGBTQ, but I'm like, what the hell are they doing? I got these kids. I'm barely struggling to get my daughter to know how she's not her brother. And boy, did they change. I mean, she went from here to here. She didn't give up her values, but just like you said, the moment she had 2 kids and she was confronted with real world activities, boy, did her opinion start to change on a few things.
And then there's the economic side. The suburbs and the rural areas in particular, that's where oil is drilled, natural gas is drilled, where most of the factories are, where most of the people who are involved in logistics, who have to drive the big rigs, those people have a very different worldview than somebody who's designing chips for video games. I mean, they're different things. We have to ask ourselves, does all this social media, does it really make things better? I'm not so sure that's the case. I mean, the particularly the way that young people are targeted by the stuff, I think it's very negative. So I think what you've got this growing gap in terms of economic function, geography, and things like marital status. which make a big difference. It's, you know, it's like they're trying to figure out like why all of a sudden are Asians and Hispanics moving to the center or even to the right? Well, because when the Democrats were doing as they should be doing and dealing with economic issues and helping these people figure out a way to get into the middle class, they're throwing out transgenderism and they're throwing out, you know, net zero, all the things that really don't do any good for this type of person. And so the Democrats have, you know, squandered this. And that's why they're so desperate, I think, to have Trump run, because they figure, well, Trump is such a jerk that, you know, we'll be able to win, even though the people aren't with us.
I've always said, as a Latino people are natural Republicans. It's just, it's for the Democrats to lose. It's for the Democrats to lose. They're naturally very religious, pro-military, pro-family, a lot of those traditional values. And here in California, I can't tell you the number of Asian families that I see, and they go to Costco and they got mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, and all the kids. I mean, family unit. Those are things Republicans typically talk about. I totally get it. Makes sense. I want to ask you, I'm sorry.
And then you can add religion. Like, for instance, what are the LA Dodgers doing, having people who are making fun of the Catholic Church, you know, sort of drag, you know, drag queens making fun of the Catholic Church? Would it be okay if we got the Ku Klux Klan to get up there and do a routine about Black people? I mean,
yeah. Latin people are very religious. I'm not, but my mom is a devout Catholic. And to be playing around with that is, I guess you don't want those votes. That's the only thing. I guess you don't want those votes.
Well, and I think it's also a question of, you know, I think people live in a, you know, again, in a sort of ideational bubble. They only read the stuff that they're in their selected units. Like, I'll give you a good
please.
What would you know about Hunter Biden if you read the New York Times and listened to NPR?
Nothing at all, but he's a good kid.
Right. I mean, even though we have solid evidence. I mean, you know, if you look at issues like climate change, the NPR, AP, and even Consumer Reports have all been bought by green nonprofits that pay for reporters to write hysterical stories. I mean, look, I think, you know, environment's a big issue, and I think that there are some issues with climate change that we should pay attention to.
Of course.
But you know, you're being fed this information. And so what happens is people live in this world where they never have their views challenged. And they just reinforce the same things. You know, one of the great advantages of reading newspapers in the past, I come from a newspaper background, you know, is that you never quite knew what was on the next page. You know, I may not have put down Africa as one of my main interests, but there'd be a story on Africa. And then the other big question is the media. It can't be trusted. I mean, it's just at this stage, and I'm not saying the right-wing media is I would trust either, but you know, you have people who they're really being taught in journalism schools that the way that your job is to proselytize, to get people to go in a certain point of view. When I was a young reporter, one of my favorite stories, I wrote a piece and I put a little thing that had my opinion, and my editor at the time, Dick Horowitz at the Washington Post, said, "Nobody gives a shit what you think." And I thought that was great. Like, yeah, I mean, you know, you're doing a straight news story, you know, and then what I find very interesting.
Sorry, that's pretty fun. That's pretty funny. Sorry,
I read I read a story, and what do I see? I don't see anybody looking for other points of view, other things. Like, you know, you think about Black Lives Matter. You couldn't say a word against them, and it turned out to be a complete scam. These people were, you know, far to the left from day one, but the mainstream media, because my favorite image for the media was when the CNN reporter said mostly peaceful protests. The city's burning in this background
with fire behind him. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, and then on the other hand, every single person at January 6th was attempting to overthrow the government and try to get into the building, even though that building couldn't handle that many people. Yeah, you're right. Polarization on both sides. They're all in on it. No, we did nothing wrong. Yeah. Why did it? You've been in the media. You're an American. You're a professor. You've been around. I'm guessing that you're saying there was a time when we didn't do this, when we didn't go, I just watch my side. I don't know anything on the other side, and I don't care. There was a time where we didn't do this in America. Is that true?
Well, the media has historically, certainly in the last half century, been more liberal than conservative.
Okay.
But there was an obligation. If you talk to the older reporters, and unfortunately they're retiring or being cashiered, they believe that their job was to inform people and to say, hey, this is what one person says, here's what another person says. But now you get this sort of uniformity. And it's funny. Sometimes I'll go back into an article that was done in the media, let's say, about, New York is going to be inundated by 2020, if we don't do X, Y, Z. Well, I was just there last week. It seems to still be there.
Surprise.
What we're doing is we're ratcheting up hysteria, whether it's on the right or on the left. It's this idea the world is coming to an end. If the other side gets into power, it's the end of the world. And the problem is that then allows for all sorts of behavior. In the case of the right, you have the January 6th. I mean, I don't know if these people should all go to jail for as long as they're going, but they certainly don't deserve any praise, that's for sure. And they should serve some sort of time. On the other hand, the Black Lives Matter protests and the Antifa protests, hardly anyone got arrested.
And yet there was 22 American cities burning at one point.
And you know what? America's cities, I mean, yes, the movement to working online has had an impact, but I think it's the danger factor. I mean, I just give you an illustration. I was just in New York, and I'm one of those old-fashioned reporters who actually likes to go in the field. Even at my
God forbid.
age, so I went up to the South Bronx to go to a charter school, a Catholic charter school. It's trying to deal with problems there. You go there and you say, what's the difference between that and Santo Domingo? What's the difference? I mean, it is like something out of a Caribbean slum, or something worse. People, pooping on the streets right in front.
Oh, yeah.
Lying on the ground. Or like when I went there, I said, should I take the subway to get up there? He said, no. I mean, my friends who are dedicated, long-term New Yorkers won't take the subway anymore.
Really?
Yeah. And if they take it, they'll take it in Manhattan during the day.
The subway's the classic way to get around New York. I visited 5 times. That's part of New York culture.
So and I used to carry a New York subway card with me all the time.
That's classic New York. Take the subway.
And now you're afraid. And it's even worse in areas where there's less transit riders, like the Bay Area or LA.
Yeah.
Where the trains are, they're filled with homeless people. There's all sorts of incidents going on. So we have to really begin to tackle some very serious problems. And as long as the left refuses to acknowledge crime and the right refuses to acknowledge that there is such a thing as discrimination and there is lack of opportunity, we're never going to get anywhere. You have to look at both things as problems to solve.
Let me ask you though, because you really hit on something that I found interesting. People live in their own worlds where their views aren't challenged. Yet I think what you're saying, and what I've heard other people, is it wasn't always this way. Yes, reporters were mostly left, but they tried to be biased. I remember a time when it was your professional job to confuse viewers as to your political affiliation.
Right.
Maybe you weren't that great at it, but you were supposed to try, damn it. You were supposed to try. And now that's gone. When did we get here? I know this is a not academic question and this is more of an
observation. I'm not an academic, so that's okay.
Yeah, but when did you living your life, notice that's different. We're not doing it the way we used. When did you have that inkling pop into your head? What year was that?
I think the roots are sociological, which is the newspaper business used to be a working class profession. You were a craftsman. You weren't it wasn't a profession with, where you have to have your degrees and everything.
Mm.
So what you got more and more university types. I remember when I was at the Post, I thought Ben Bradley thought I was like some guy from the sticks because I didn't go to Harvard. I'm sorry, I went to Berkeley. I mean, at that time, I would say Berkeley may have been the greatest university in the world, but that's okay.
California universities consistently outrank East Coast Ivy League universities in the last 10 years. So you got a better education.
But the bottom line is that when you started to get the university people in, that's when it started to change. When I was at the Post, I remember the guy next to me was an Italian guy, working class guy, whose brother was a Baltimore cop. So he had a perspective on things that was just different than what you would have if all your friends are teaching at Princeton. It's a very, very different thing. So what the disease that has infected the university and made it, I think one of the, if you had to have an axis of evil, they would be in there. The universities have now taken their mindset and put it into the media. You think about and now increasingly, unbelievably, in the corporate world. What sort of imbecile does a transgender show for Bud Light?
I'm not going to get into it. But help me out. So you're a viewer, you don't have an education, you don't have your experience, you're watching this. Tell me a story. Was it 2005, 2010, 2015? Or I know it's not going to be exact, but hey, I was having a beer and I was noticing the reporter came on and said, screw telling the other side. And that's when it clicked on to me, things have changed. When did this, do you roughly notice this went this way?
I think it happened in stages. First of all, a lot of the secondary newspapers, which tended to be a little bit less liberal, like the Tabs, like let's say the New York Post, which is still there, the Daily News is still there.
Sure.
But most cities don't have those anymore. In LA, we used to have the Herald Examiner was a very, it was a very in Yiddish we would use the term hamisha, very, very much a grassroots paper. So first of all, you now have greater concentration of journalism in fewer places. Neiman at Harvard did a very good study on this, which, local newspapers are a joke now. They're basically AP, wire copy, and maybe New York Times. They're not independently reported. So that's part of it. Then you had the election of President Obama, which like many Americans, are very proud of that we elected him. But all of a sudden, you couldn't criticize the White House. So we got into that pattern, and then after Obama, then we had Trump, and the media lost its head. It became, and they began to say in the New York Times, well, now that Trump is there, we don't have to be fair because Trump is such a threat. And so, we got this, all the Russiagate stuff, and and the terrible thing is this is exactly what's keeping Donald Trump alive, because the average working class person, or at least a lot of them, are going to look at this and say, well, they're going after him because he's fighting for us. Now, I'm not saying he is, but I'm saying the image that's there, and then who is going into journalism today? Where are they living? Who are the people they're with? And you just don't have the old-fashioned reporters for whom this was a way of making a living. You were part of the union. You had a much more sort of grassroots feel. Plus, many of the reporters were a little bit older. They maybe they owned a home. They had kids. They lived in the suburbs. You have less and less now. More and more, the news media is pretty much concentrated in New York, Washington, and somewhat in LA, but basically New York and Washington. and they're all the same people. They're the same people with the same values, went to the same schools, and have the same ideas. It's not very interesting.
I remember reading about the media consolidation of America roughly around 2000 to 2015, and they were saying you used to have about 450 separate companies reporting the news in America, and now it's 5.
Well, and that's a huge problem. So what you end up with is essentially what you have is you've got the Fox, New York Post, Daily Mail, that sort of gathering, and then you've got the CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and those have now become just openly left wing, figuring the talking points. It's hard for me to believe that today, that there's almost no accounting for what happened in Afghanistan. There's almost no accounting for the Hunter Biden thing. There's almost no accounting for the fact. Just watch a video. This guy shouldn't be president. And look, I can speak. I just turned 70. I know I'm not capable of doing things that I could do 10 years ago, and I certainly wouldn't be mentally as strong as I. There are some things that age brings you, but the kind of work. We should have presidents who are more like President Obama's age or President Bush's age. People who are physically there, who are at a fairly high point in their mental evolution. How do we have a president? I mean, I always wonder, like, what happens when Biden talks with Macron? I'd love to get one of those bubbles and say, what is Macron actually thinking? There's this doddering old man, who was never particularly smart to start with.
No comment. Interesting point. You said it. I'm just here interviewing.
And also, how do you have, how do you have a vice president like Kamala Harris? I mean, you just sit there and say, is this the best you could do?
Oh, she's dumb. I'll go ahead and say that. She's dumb, and she doesn't make us look good in California. And if you talk to women in California who are minorities and ask, are you proud of her? They will say no. You won't see that in the news, but I'm actually here in California, and I know a lot of minorities, but you won't see that in the news.
Because I think the media has made a very dangerous decision, the mainstream media, not all, that their job is to be the handmaidens of the progressive state. I mean, that's basically what they.
Okay, so let me ask you a couple of questions. You mentioned this a little bit, and it kind of lines up. So you said you noticed a lot of the rise in polarization, the election of Obama, and then going into Trump. That lines up with the rise of media becoming very polarized and the rise of social media,
right,
heavily affecting our political thinking. So is social media and media the cause? And before you answer, part two is, let's imagine you had a wand. Magic wand. You wave this wand and the universe turns into whatever you want. Or Thanos' glove from the Marvel movies, whatever. Is it because of media and social media? And if you could wave a wand and magically get them regulated, and I mean, it goes through the House and the Congress and the President and Supreme Court, and everybody signs off, and they all agree to some law. Is this something we could fix? I don't want to talk about would we get a law passed. Is it even possible to have regulations that could bring the media and social media into line so that they could not polarize us if they are the cause of the polarization? So kind of a two-part.
It's certainly a contributor to polarization, that's for sure. I don't know what you can do necessarily. I'm not a big fan, particularly of Elon Musk on a lot of issues, but the fact that he is the only one of the tech oligarchs who thinks at all differently. I mean, you think about it, they all think the same. 98% of the tech industry contributions went to Biden. So the problem is, you have to have different forms of social media. I don't know if there's going to be a market for real discussion. Now, what I find with students is they like the discussion. I mean, I had a class and I've had a Muslim, I've had a Coptic Christian, I've had a Catholic, I've had a Jewish person giving their different perspectives. The kids liked it. I mean, I don't think that they necessarily would, have this very blinkered view, but it's not being offered to them, in the university, and it's not being offered in the media.
So even if you wanted a more balanced view, it's hard to find a place to get that from. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. Have you, I believe the answer is already yes, but let me ask you, just so everybody following along, do you know about the big sort from Bill Bishop?
Yes.
Do you believe in it? Is it real?
I think there's some truth to it. I mean, I think he doesn't get as much into the economic function. He doesn't get as much into the ethnic aspect as I would. But I mean, there's clearly something going on where people of a similar point of view tend to congregate in certain places. The problem that you get is when you get that, then you get all sorts of crazy laws. You get sometimes overly restrictive laws on the right, and then more often you get very restricted views on from the left, and so the big problem we have is that information from essentially one source or the other, and the number of old-fashioned reporters who still think it's their job to sort of inform, that's gone down considerably.
Seeing that, I can only think of a couple. I've heard people mention George Will, but people have to think hard these days, I've noticed, before they can name even one or two reporters who are still around and consistently try to sell both sides or tell both sides, which doesn't seem like a good thing. So just to clarify, you do believe that roughly since the 1990s, Americans have been moving, and maybe they're doing it consciously. Maybe they're not doing it consciously. Maybe they're moving for politics. Maybe they're just moving for lifestyle. But for whatever reason, they're moving, and we're getting more ideologically sorted across the country into red and blue counties and states. Okay. That was the big. So, okay, well, then here's the next question. When Marjorie Taylor Greene made her statement about how we need a national divorce because we can't get along, red and blue, and I get that she's not the greatest spokesperson. Some people like her. Some people think she's dumb. I'm not here to discuss that. My issue was that after she said that, the media response on the left and right mainstream for the first month seemed to be, there's no real polarization or division. It's just you and you're making it up. When that didn't work, the second month it seemed to be, okay, there is polarization, but it's because of the media and social media and gerrymandering. And if we somehow fix those, everything's going to be popped up into place. And I read 30 articles across the left and the right, mainstream, low stream, not one brought up the big sort. They all went after media and social media, which you could say may have been a problem in like Obama, Trump. The big sort goes back to the 1990s, 20 years earlier. Right. How did 30 separate newspapers all forget about the big sort and all focus exclusively on media and social media? How did that happen in America?
They're self-referential. How do you know? How do you know how things look differently in North Dakota if you never go to North Dakota? How do you know what reality is in the South Bronx if you don't go to the South Bronx? How do you know how people feel if you don't sit down and talk to them? You don't talk to political consultants. You talk to regular human beings. And I think that until we're willing to go, and reporters are willing to go out in the field, and one of the problems that I find with a lot of people is when I was a reporter growing up, you always tried to, have lunch or get drinks with sources and sort of get to know them.
Yeah, like in the movies.
You just get somebody sends you a bunch of questions on email. Well, they don't know who you are. They don't. You
I
know,
remember the movies where the reporter would go out to the alleyway to meet the source, to get to know him, to get in. It doesn't seem like that happens that much anymore. They go off whatever they
I
heard
don't
on
see
the
it.
AP
I mean,
wire.
it may happen in Washington, in that very, where there's, you want to get some reaction from a senator or somebody high in the government. But generally speaking, the people going out in the field, and it's not just ideological; it's also economic. If I'm going to go and interview people in Riverside County, I live in Orange County. If I want to interview somebody in Riverside County, I got to figure that's the day. It's an hour there, an hour back, an hour meeting. That you're going to use up your time. So much more, in quote, efficient to stay at home and just have emails back and forth.
Fine, but if we do that, all of these reporters and news agencies on the left and right are saying, we're professional fact checkers. We do research. We check the facts. And some of these news agencies did report on the big sort in prior years, but they forgot about it after Marjorie Taylor Greene made her statement. How do you accidentally forget prior years reporting on a key issue when you call yourself a fact-checking organization?
Well, first of all, I mean, the fact checking is very often itself is incredibly biased.
Oh.
I mean, they're the same people the reporters are. They have the same point of view. They'll say, well, the only truth, let's say, on climate is the most extreme green perspective on climate. You don't bother talking to anybody else. You don't talk to Steve Koonin. You don't talk to Roger Pilkey. You don't talk to Judith Curry, because they're not part of what you consider the acceptable points of view.
I noticed this. You were talking about how there used to be a time where you had mainstream newspapers and then you had kind of a second tier newspapers. And a lot of the mainstream reporters were left. But at that second tier newspapers, you might get some conservatives or some more moderate stance. I noticed that with Marjorie Taylor Greene in the discussion. So all the mainstream news on the right and on the left could not mention the big sort at all, even though it predates social media and gerrymandering by like 10 to 20 years. But little newspapers, the local whatever X daily that's still holding on, would mention the big sort. And I go, isn't that weird that these local newspapers, most of them at least mention the big sort along with media and social media, and yet 100% of all the mainstream news could not mention it at all, even though it's been priorly reported.
Well, because
Isn't that weird?
They want to talk about themselves and their friends and the world they live in, and they're not particularly interested in the world that other people live in.
So we have a lot of Americans. They're scared. They see January 6th. They see 22 cities on fire. They can sense polarization is bad. And they go to the news to learn about it and what's being done. And they're basically being misinformed because those people, they don't want to really get into it. They have kind of their own biases and they think that's cool. Is that roughly accurate?
Yeah. Basically it, it follows their sort of worldview, and they get patted on the back for doing it, and trying to come up with something original is just not very easy, and to understand that issues are very, very complex and nuanced, and and there's sometimes you can have something like, okay, I understand there may be a problem with the environment that we want to deal with. On the other hand, having electricity costs that are 2 to 3 times the national average isn't very good for working class people.
Right.
But they don't even mention it. I mean, I have a good friend in San Francisco, Jennifer Hernandez, and Jennifer did an incredible report called The Green Jim Crow. It was about how the green policies have really hurt minorities and the working class people. She can't get arrested at the San Francisco Chronicle. They're never going to talk to her. I've had my friend Robert Price did a whole big study on rural areas objecting to gigantic solar farms. And NPR spent 2 hours with him, and then when the piece finally came out, they never mentioned it.
What? So sometimes the media will outright cut content that they feel you, the public, don't need to hear. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, you
Wow.
basically you want to strengthen your point of view, particularly if you really believe the apocalypse is upon us. Then
Yeah.
you can justify it's like the Catholic Church, during the Middle Ages. We were going to head towards some sort of apocalypse. So, any behavior that fit in there would be that would violate their point of view was not only wrong, but it was also dangerous.
Yeah, like when they had I saw some picture of ancient like medieval Catholic drawings, and it was this guy with a telescope and Satan was whispering into his ear, right? Because they had that fight with science. So at that time that it's evil. Um Quick question. I don't want to get bogged down into it, but just something I ask people. So it sounds like we have reporters and a media agency who says this is what's right for the public, and I know what's best for them. And I
Right,
don't want to expose them to ideas that could confuse them or get them pulling away from these ideas that we know are right. And I don't want to put ideas that might, trouble them. I want to let them know the world makes sense. We're going in the right place. Keep believing what we're doing. Everything's going right. I noticed there's this country called China. And in China, they have a media that says our job is not to tell the truth, it's to support the government
right,
because the government knows what's best for the people.
right.
And we know better than these people. And sometimes it's important for us to make sure news doesn't get out so people won't question the government. And also because the Chinese people have a delicate mind and we don't want to upset them. So sometimes we just won't tell them certain things. What is the difference between Chinese media and American media after the discussion we've just had?
Well, first of all, in America, in the media and even in academia, particularly, I'm very proud to say Chapman University has been very good on free speech. Um, but I mean, I think the difference is in China, the government controls the media. To some extent, the tech oligarchs and social media control the government, or are
Sure.
joined at the hip
But
with the
when we
government.
s- but when we see things like the Twitter files that
Yes,
show
that's what I'm thinking of.
people directly from the federal government instructing social media what to say in order to control the conversation, how's that different than China?
Well, the difference is, at least in this country, you can still have a contrarian point of view. You can find it. Now, the problem is that when I look at Google and I look at what's happening with chat, it's so biased that it's really worthless from a research point of view. I mean, Google, which I used to love and I found enormously helpful, has become so politicized that, if I ask a question like, what is the biggest source of reduction in GHG in the planet? And it's
Hmm.
clearly natural gas, coal and natural gas. Try to find that on Google. You've
Right.
got to go to the fifth, sixth, seventh page.
Yep.
So the problem is that the sources of information are now so biased, um, and and these companies, they all have the same point of view. And I think part of it is that these are not journalists who control these companies. These are engineers. These are 1-0 people. So they don't understand. They didn't study history. They didn't know. I'll bet you if I could get in the room 10 top tech executives and started asking them about the Constitution or basic questions of American history, they would not be able to answer.
So a lot of the people in the media don't have a understanding of quintessential American values that made us the country that we are, and they aren't concerned about it, and they don't really seem to have a strong understanding of Western values in general. Is that
Right. Right.
okay? Isn't that just like the Chinese who run the media there?
Well,
They
at least
don't,
the Chinese
they don't
like their
talk
own
about,
values.
yeah, but I mean, they don't have Western values. They don't believe in Western values. They don't know Western values. And it sounds like our reporting agency's the same. I just kind of a
Well, I
casual
mean,
observation.
again, I think we have not gotten yet to a point where our censorship is excuse me, anything like China's.
Okay.
I I would I wouldn't say that, but I would say that there's a there's a move towards what some people call a confluence between our system and their system.
Mm.
Um, and when you think about it, like I just wrote a piece about NVIDIA in Unheard. The head of NVIDIA says, "Oh, China's going to be the future technology, and we want to send them the most advanced chips designs to China. That's my big market." So what are we going to do? We're going to give them chips that they can use for weapons to attack us. Is that? But frankly, I think a lot of these tech guys really could give a damn about where the U.S. is going. What's going on outside of their little world. They think of themselves as globalists and global players,
Right.
and the impact on America is not important. And yet, I would make the final statement, which is, take a look what's happening on the streets in this country. Take a look at what's going on. And if you think that more video games and virtual reality and Bitcoin and AI are the solution to our problems, I think you're missing the big picture.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also think the Chinese agree. They heavily regulate social media for their children. They cut the number of hours and what they can do because they think it could be a potentially negative influence on their kids.
Yeah.
And they don't want that to happen to their children. What madness, right? They're concerned about their kids and their growth and think social media could be a bad influence. Wow, crazy. Okay, getting back to the main discussion. How bad does political polarization in America get in the future? Will it get better on its own? Maybe we have a kumbaya moment. Maybe people peter out their anger and they go, oh, I just needed to blow off some steam. Or is there no reason to believe it will calm down in the future at all?
Well, societies have a tendency to be able to correct. And I find with disease, the next generation, much more openness to different ideas than I did among the millennials. And as my youngest daughter's 18, and she says, you know what? You have to understand, we hate the millennials more than we hate the boomers.
I've heard that.
And Sam Abrams at AEI and some other people have looked at the disease, and not that they're conservatives necessarily, but that they're much more open-minded. They're much more aware that they're being manipulated.
Yeah.
And I think that there's some hope there, that the next generation will look at this world and say, I want to know things. I want to think for myself and not have everything instructed to me. So, I'll leave you with that hopefulness that, I find that talking with the students or with my daughter and her friends, that they have much more open views. There are certain issues where they're all going to be, oriented towards one side or the other. But I think they're much more open-minded. I think the millennials were a particular group who grew up during a time of enormous prosperity, and boomers spoiled the crap out of them. And the Zs are growing up in a much tougher world and maybe have a much more realistic perspective.
Okay. I appreciate that. Do you see any reason why the sorting may stop? Americans moving into ideological like-minded communities, the pattern's gone since the 1990s, continued over the last 3 decades. Is there any reason to believe that the big sort will slow down or stop? Or is it more likely logical to assume it's just going to keep on, at least at the pace it's had since the 92?
Well, I think there are going to be some counterfactuals. Your friend who has children is part of that. As millennials have kids, they begin to have different priorities. It's one thing to be a huge defender of the Chicago Board of Education until you actually have to send a kid there.
Right.
So I think that there will be, some forces that will change when you're being told, no, you have to get rid of your gas stove, or you have
Yeah.
to buy an electric car. The more sort of authoritarian, I think there will be, some pushback. And then the last thing is the movement of minorities into the suburbs in particular, and millennials, is going to just change what they're like. Um, I mean, people like to talk about racism, but this country's got an enormous amount of intermarriage, a lot of
Mhm.
interracial dating. I look at my kids' friends, and they're as likely to be, Indian or Chinese or Hispanic than they are to be white. And I think those kids are going to have a very different worldview than those people who grew up a little bit older when maybe the subs were 70% white. But that's no longer the case.
I agree. Have you ever heard of a man called Norman Ornstein?
Yes.
Okay, so he made a prediction. He's a demographer. I want to repeat a statistic I use in every talk. By 2040 or so, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states, meaning 30% of Americans will choose 70 senators. And that 30% will be older, whiter, more rural, more male than the 70%. He's talking about that, yeah, you can start to say, where is the American people's opinions? Okay, well, more people are on the coast. So the opinion of America starts to get a little bit more progressive. But 35, 40 states in the interior,
But
they're not going that way. They're going the opposite way.
Well, because the reason is people are moving to small towns and interior states. That's where almost all the growth is, certainly not on the coast. And I think that you're going to see that, there's going to be a considerable movement in the country. Look, you have mega states like Florida and Texas that have become, major conservative areas.
Sure. But when we look at the interior, what he's talking about is the Midwest and the South and kind of the interior country where young people are leaving to go to big cities.
But that's not because these reporters are living in the past.
Okay.
Take a look at where millennials are going.
Okay.
They're leaving New York, they're leaving LA, they're leaving San Francisco, and they're going, to Dallas, to Houston, to Phoenix, to Florida, to Nashville, to Tennessee. The problem with political reporters is they really don't study what's going on the ground, and they don't understand that this image that was which was always exaggerated. All the young people are going to the big cities. That was never quite the case, and it's now exactly the opposite. So when you have large populations of minorities and millennials moving to the interior states, it's a very different picture. And now what's also happening is, as these people leave, particularly millennials who are having kids and minorities, the minorities who leave are the more upwardly mobile, the more ambitious. What you get left with, unfortunately, in the coastal areas is a combination of the very, very high end and the low end, what the late Fred Siegel used to call the upstairs, downstairs coalition. Very little in the middle.
So you're saying the trend is opposite, and minorities and immigrants and young people are moving or choosing to stay in states like Iowa or Mississippi.
Well, I don't think they're going to Mississippi, but they're certainly going to Iowa. They're certainly going to Columbus, Ohio. They're going to Indianapolis. Every region has a different thing.
Sure.
But you're talking about, give you one example, and I got to go soon, but
one
example. Since 2000, the county of Los Angeles, where I lived 40 years, has lost 750,000 people under the age of 25. California is getting old. The young people, sometimes young people will go when they're going to college in their early 20s, but once they want to settle down, buy a house, get married, have kids, they're going somewhere else. They're either going to the suburbs or exurbs of the big metros, or they're moving to other metros.
I hope you felt that this was a fair conversation,
Sure.
not gotcha journalism. Do you have any recommendations? Is there anyone you know who may be willing to be part of an honest conversation?
Oh, there's some great people out there. Michael Lind would be at the top of the list. He's got a book out now called Hell to Pay, which examines the problem of having so many people making low wages. I think, he would be a very good person. He just left the University of Texas. There's, if you wanted to get into the censorship issue, there's Jake Siegel, who did, the big study for Tablet on the censorship industrial complex. There's Mike Schellenberger. I mean, there's what's really encouraging to me is people who have historically been on the left, Matt Taibbi, Andrew Sullivan.
Right.
There's a bunch of these people who just can't take it anymore. They've just had it. And, they're not comfortable with Donald Trump, and they're not comfortable with Marjorie Taylor Greene, and they're not comfortable with the Republican Party as it is now, but they are not comfortable with the Democratic Party. Roy Teixeira would be a great one. He's and he was a big Democratic strategist. He wrote the coming Democratic majority.
Oh, okay. That's
a book that he now is saying, I was wrong.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, he backed away. One author stayed with the premise and the other author backed away. Okay, last question. I'll let you go. Thank you so much. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third party. You're watching this video 5 days from now. You're struggling to remember what exactly we talked about. But there was this one thought that the guest said, and boy, you can't get out of your head. What is that one thought you want an average random American watching this video to have that they can't get out of their head 5 days from now?
I think the important thing is the emphasis on open debate and the emphasis on trying to understand the people who you may not agree with and understand why they got to that point of view. And that sometimes will change your view somewhat.
Thank you. We'll leave it there. I'll email you in a little bit a copy of the interview. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.